When will precognition, psychokinesis, and telepathy be taken seriously by mainstream science? Stick around for an in-depth discussion about the science of the paranormal. Welcome to the Peep Podcast. I'm your host, Nicolle, and I'm grateful you're here. The two big ideas behind the Peep Podcast are to show that the paranormal is more normal than most people think, and to connect the science to the psi, including ESP, hauntings, and psychokinesis. In this episode, you'll meet JM DeBord, author of the recently published book, The Science of the Paranormal, The Truth Behind Telepathy, ESP, Reincarnation, and More Mysterious Phenomena. But first, a quick reminder that I'm adding anyone who needs it to my Reiki grid for a week at a time. If you are struggling, stressing, or just in need of a little positive healing energy, use the contact form at peeppodcast.com to let me know. Listen to episode 115 for more information. This episode's interview is one of my longest, so I want to jump right into it. J.M. DeBord is the most trusted name in dream interpretation, leading the largest online community for dream sharing, r/dreams, and reaching millions of people. Known there as Rad Owl, since 2009 he has shared his expertise in the spirit of openness with millions of people who visit every year. Their trust in him speaks volumes. He is co-host of the podcast Dreams That Shape Us, where he explores the life-changing power of dreams and brings to his listeners the deeply personal stories of his guests. Since 2017, more than 5,000 students across 200 countries have taken JM's online courses in dream interpretation called Owl's School of Dreaming. Authoring 4 acclaimed books about dreams adds to that trust. In 2025, he put years of research into a new book, The Science of the Paranormal, The Truth Behind Telepathy, ESP, Reincarnation, and More Mysterious Phenomena. And I'm grateful to have him join me for this discussion of some of the topics covered in it. Let's dive in with JM. Hi, JM. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nicole. Thank you for having me on your show and giving me this opportunity to talk to your people.
Thank you for coming on. I'm so excited to have you. I love talking about science and psi and the science of psi. And you've written a book called The Science of the Paranormal. So, we have a whole lot that we can talk about. But I want to start with the same question I ask everyone when they come on the show. And
Mhm.
that is, what sparked your interest in the paranormal?
Mm. You'd have to go back to childhood for something, the true answer to something like that. I could say it was, I've run across some of the research and found it to be fascinating and wondered why there isn't more interest in it from, the larger community and just people in general that says, hey, come on, you asked for science to prove that this stuff is right, you know, and that there's some kind of evidence for this, and it's actually there if you would just go and look at it, which of course I compiled that all together in my book. And so I would say that the just knowing that my interest in the science, is the first thing that has gotten me approaching what you might call interest in the paranormal. But the true story really goes back to childhood. There was one night, I had this reflecting telescope, got it for my birthday, eighth birthday or something like that. And I would go out, a couple times a week and look into the sky, watch the moon, maybe look for a planet, maybe be real distant because I didn't have a real powerful telescope or anything. So if I'm trying to look at, Jupiter, it's going to be a long way, just a little dot in my viewfinder. But one night I pointed the telescope at the sky and I saw something that looked like this like a ring made of clouds in a circle that reminded me of something I'd seen in an astronomy magazine. It looked like the Ring Nebula. But I'm
Okay.
like, wait a minute, the Ring Nebula is way far away. I couldn't be seeing that in my telescope, but I kept looking back at it and I knew what I saw in the viewfinder because I kept like, I'd blink my eyes and be like, okay, I'm just seeing something, or it's a reflection, or it's a cloud that I'm not. I'm like, but no, it's perfectly clear night, and for a cloud to be shaped like, almost like a smoke ring, so it filled up the lens, but it was this circular cloud thing. And I had this oddest sense of like it looks like an eye. And so if I'm looking at it through my, I'm reasoning through this in my 8 or 9 year old mind. I'm
Mhm.
reasoning through this going, well, if I'm seeing it, then it might be seeing me too. So, you know, it got me, it made me my first time that something happened that was outside of the predictable or the ordinary, or, like I was already at that age. You think you're kind of getting a sense of the world, but then something comes along that says, well, maybe it doesn't operate in the way that you thought it did. Maybe there's
Mhm.
more to it, and so that would say that's where my interest began.
That is a great story and so unique too. Usually the answer is, "Oh, I saw a ghost," or something like that. No. So, did you talk to an adult? Like, did you ask anybody what it might have been, or did
Oh,
you just kind of keep it?
I might have brought it up to my parents and asked, but I knew that I knew more about astronomy at that age than they did because I had a subscription to astronomy magazine, and I would just devour it for whatever reason, it was like this. I wanted to go looking out there at the sky and just think about what could be out there looking back, and still to this day, I've had, you know, experiences like that in Sedona recently. We'll bring that up at maybe at some point during the interview, but something flashed at me from the sky in Sedona. And I was like, oh, wow, that is the coolest thing. I was looking almost dead at it when it did it. And it was way too much of an anomaly. I've been around airplanes and
Yeah.
airports and plane. I know what the patterns and all that. And for something to do that, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. Like it was almost like it was winking at me.
That is
So
really
anyway,
cool. Oh,
my
I mean, you
experience of
can you can go farther into that right now if you want to. I love just letting the conversation flow.
Yeah,
So,
sorry. Don't mean to talk over you. Yeah, chain of associations. It made me think of that. And I'm like, oh, Nicolle would love to hear that because I did. I was sitting there laying on this. I was at a B&B in Sedona after going to this conference in Phoenix. I was presented as a dream. I gave like a workshop on dream interpretation to this big crowd in this conference room in this hotel in downtown Phoenix. And the guy who hosted that then brought me up to his B&B in Sedona, and he told me, he said, you should go lay on the back, like he had this nice area where you could just completely chill. It was called the Buddha B&B or something like that. Fabulous place on a hillside in Sedona, far enough away from many lights that you can really see the dark sky. And he had an area laid out where you could just lay down. So I did. I was like, I'm chilling out, got, and something nearby to eat or drink or whatever, and just chilling out. And I'm looking at the sky, and I've been doing it for a long time, off and on in the evening, and
mhm.
finally, I was sitting there looking at something. I was like, well, that's an unusual thing kind of traveling across the sky. I wonder what that is. And then right off close to it, this thing went flash. Zoop. And then I could kind of see this little tiny dot trailing off what had been in the center of that thing.
Whoa.
But yeah, I mean, it was bright enough. I'm like, geez, anybody who's looking at the sky right now is going to see that. But of course, in my book, I show that there are people who've had such powerful psychokinetic effects that they've been able to make things like that happen.
Right.
It's actually contained within the psyche of the person, this ability to make things manifest in the sky in really dramatic ways. So, if you ask me, well, was that a UFO up there talking to you? I'd be like, well, you could call it that, you know, but is projection of my own mind. I mean, I do know what I saw. I do know I
Mhm.
was perfectly capable, it wasn't a reflection, it wasn't a satellite, it wasn't a, I know how to go through that. And it's like, no, actually, that was amazing, actually. And the synchronicity of it, which is kind of the magic of it, is that it feels meaningful.
Yeah.
My friend told me to watch the sky, and I did that night, and it blinked at me. And he's like, "Man, I live up here, and that happens all the time." I'm like, yeah, I bet it does.
That
Anyway,
is Sedona
Sedona.
is supposed to be one of those magical places, and I have not gotten there yet, but it is on my bucket list.
It'll call to you when the time is right. Yeah, it's a neat place. And there are places I think on the planet where these things happen more often, like Skinwalker Ranch.
Hmm.
I wasn't able to talk much about Skinwalker in my book because the research and the stuff that's come out about it hasn't really gone through the publication channels. And
Hmm.
there was a point early in the book where I had to decide what exactly is the science of the paranormal. And it was basically that it had to be coming through published research. And um, because there's all sorts of sources from outside of that. And I did include things like, I read some of the books by these people, like some of the remote viewers, Joe
Hmm.
McMoneagle, and I read their books and watched video interviews of them and stuff like that to get background. But in the end, if I made a claim about something that you might call the real science of the paranormal, it had to be backed up by something that's been published, or talked about by somebody who's in the publishing world and is recognized in science as somebody who tries to follow the rules, you know.
Right.
So even if it is a subject that in the end, trying to replicate this stuff has become a sticking point. The A lab will produce something that pretty remarkable results. Like let's say they're able to bend spoons or something like that, and you try to replicate it at other labs, and it just doesn't. They just can't do it. And so anyway, it gets back into some of the science side of it is that people are hung up on some of these things that they really shouldn't be, because if they would expand beyond the published research to what these people who were involved with it said about what they experienced, then there is absolutely no question that a lot of this stuff is real.
Hmm.
Psychokinesis, telepathy, precognition. It's absolutely, and not only is it like there's the research side of it, which I think is clearly demonstrated that something there is there. It's in the numbers, but there's also the people involved
Hmm.
who did things that and had personal experiences of it. So in the book, I tried to include both of those sides of the story. Like the psychologist Elizabeth Mayer at the University of San Francisco had an experience where her daughter, her daughter's precious, I'm going to say it was a violin, it might have been a viola, was stolen at this recital, and handmade one of a kind instrument. And she, in desperation, trying to figure something out, because it was just gone. There was
Hmm.
no getting it back. They had no clue who took it. She went to a dowser, uh, a man who was famous for it. He was the president of the Dowsing Society at the time. He's very famous for what he did. Um, and she just explained her situation. And he said, send me a map of the area. Now, this is years ago, so she had to like get it in the overnight mail and the
Yeah.
pre-internet days, back in the 90s and stuff. Anyway, so he gets this, and he calls her back a couple days later and tells her, well, it's at this place in Oakland. He's like, it's right here on the map, or he like tells her exactly the street. So she goes there. So what would you do? If a guy just told you over the phone, 2,000 miles away, a guy tells you that he knows where this precious stolen instrument is at, and he points you towards, 47th and Walker Street in Oakland, you know. So Elizabeth, though, boy, she was a character, and she wrote some fabulous stuff about this subject because she experienced it for herself when she went down there, posted some, like, she's like, I can't just go up and knock on the door and say, like, do you have my stolen, violin? So
Right.
she posted flyers in the area asking people to call if they've seen the violin. And somebody calls her soon after and says, yeah, my neighbor has it and I can arrange for you to get it back.
Wow.
So so she goes to um, arrangements are made, and like in the back of a supermarket parking lot at, la- late in the evening, she meets some guy she's never met before who pulls up in a car, and an exchange is made, and she gets the violin back. And she said she wrote in her book about this. What led to this book was this experience. She said that on the way home, she realized that everything about how she understood the world and how the mind works had just changed, because a red line had been crossed.
Hmm.
As an academic, she would only consider things, and as a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, she would only like allow herself to go so far into, what the mind was capable of doing. And this proved to her that it was, that it proved to her that these things are possible because it happened to her. And she came up with a really fabulous theory for at least what you might call clairvoyance, which I think it's all interrelated. But for the what people experience as clairvoyance, or really that's what dowsing is a form of, well, I guess it maybe not so much clairvoyance, but anyway, before I get off track, uh, she said that if you want to understand how the mind works to perceive this sort of paranormally, to get information remotely that it shouldn't be able to, or obtain information that there's no rightful causal way you can say that the mind was able to, like this guy figuring out where the violin was from 2,000 miles away by looking at a map and figuring it out. Like she said that, speaking of maps, when you look at a map, what's the first thing you see, Nicole?
Roads.
Okay, let me
I don't
say like
know.
a world map.
Oh, okay. Um, Borders. I feel like this is a trick question. I don't know.
It is a
I
little
might
bit
be
of a, but don't
overthinking
worry,
things.
you're gonna like the punchline on this. Okay.
Okay.
So, and I would hope the audience will too. Just picture, how many times have we seen a world map? Your eyes are drawn to something on the map, and it's usually the borders of the land masses which define the shape. So I can bring to mind, Australia, and I can roughly get a shape, all the border around in my mind. I can see it, right there.
Yeah.
Now, imagine though that you reverse that and see the oceans. The ocean, you see, instead of the land masses, you see the oceans. Have you ever drawn or looked at the borders of the ocean and thought of the ocean as a land mass in the sense of the thing that you focus your attention on, and that's the shape that gets, stored in your memory?
Mm.
um,
I
so
actually I have because I have a meteorology degree and had to take an oceanography class, so I'm a little
sweet,
unusual in that way.
that's awesome. So then you totally get it. Now it might be a little less for you because you're used to that. Maybe it's not a metaphor, but just the way that I'm presenting this maybe isn't as much of a revelation to you, but other people, it was for me as I read her book and I went, oh, and she said that's where the paranormal information is coming from.
Yeah.
It's there in the background all the time, except you're usually focused on something that is preventing you from tuning into that signal.
Hmm.
Your consciousness is following your awareness. Your awareness is like a radio dial. It's tuning into certain frequencies. This information is there in the background on some other frequency, and you tune into it, and it's just like, instead of looking at the landmass, now you're looking at the oceans, and that's what you're noticing. What's in the background, what's usually in the background. Now you're focusing attention on it, and it she thinks that that's how it's work. It kind of, I don't want to call it a causal mechanism, but that she thinks that that's the road to understanding how it works, in the mind. As a psychologist, she got really interested in this, and she started having colleagues coming to her on the side, of course, because it wasn't cool yet to talk about this stuff in those professional circles, especially psychology, which is hugely biased against psi and all that.
Hmm.
And the field in general of psychology is the worst enemy we have to truly getting to the bottom of this, because Yeah. Anyway, um,
I
um,
totally understand.
so Elizabeth was wanting to understand the mind and the way it worked, and this showed her the greater capacities of the mind, and it took having her eyes opened by the personal experience of it for her to seriously put her PhD level mind to work on this. And she was really well respected. She taught at UCSF and had a private practice and all that. And so um, Elizabeth Mayer. And so, yeah, she uh, was one of the really interesting stories that I ran across and had to include in the book. Because I think some of the most interesting stories are from the people who've got a foot in both worlds. On the one
Mhm.
hand, they have the science background, and then they also have the experience background. And then you'll get people like Jeffrey Mishlove, who's made a career out of, pulling together, knowing the research, almost every drop of research that's ever gone out there of about in parapsychology. I would bet that Jeff has consumed it at some point. Um, so people like that are the ones that I've tried to bring forward in the book because I think if the public knew more about this, that it was there and it's accessible, then they might be more open to thinking of it as something that's real. And I use my air quotes here because it is more interesting than most other subjects, isn't it? Like what
Yes.
else you going to talk about? Let's talk about the stock market, like sports. Like, no, man, my mind has always gone towards these things. I've always had an interest in little bit things that are a little off the beaten path and a little wild and a little weird. And, weird is just a way of, scaring people away from something that's actually fascinating. So,
Yeah. I I say let your paranormal freak flag fly. I say it often enough, I don't trip over those words anymore. So, but I mean, truly, that, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is really important stuff. This explains, well, I won't even say this explains the mysteries that we are trying to understand all the way across all the spectrum of the paranormal is so important. And like understanding yourself, understanding the people around you is, I mean, it's psychology, it's sociology, but it's so much bigger than that because it's consciousness. And I'm just babbling at this point because I'm
I'll pick up on
I am,
consciousness
yeah.
because that was, in the research, that's what I found in the end, what it came down to. The best minds that the, okay, I don't, that's kind of a cliched word, but just people who had very high credentials and obviously displayed great, intellect, uh, looked at it and said the same thing. It's it could lead the consciousness is at the heart of this. And we've got it wrong fundamentally in the way that we're approaching this with the scientific method, because the scientific method is made for studying matter and consciousness associated with all these other phenomena, where psi phenomena we're talking about, is not a physical phenomenon. It's I don't understand why we're still stuck on this question. They've
Mhm.
been trying for over 50 years with a lot of throwing a lot of money at the wall to prove that there's some place in the brain that they can point to and say, yep, that's there where consciousness is. And without that, then the human being is just bloop, gone, erased, you know, and
Yeah.
they're trying so hard to prove that, and they haven't been able to. And the reason is because it's not provable. It's and in fact, the much better explanations have come from working consciousness in at what you might call a non-local, meaning not centered in the local, like let's just say the body is the locality. You know, my consciousness is not in this body. It's inhabited by it right now. It's here, present in this physical space, but it originates somewhere else. It's non-local. And the Nobel Prizes in physics have proven at this point that non-locality is a real thing, and we're dealing with it at a, it's saying you got to deal with me as a fact here. Your models of how the physical universe works has to include this, and you have to account for it. So I think that that this is where consciousness is coming from. It's something that's non-local, so it's non-physical. And
Hmm.
all of our models of consciousness are the only ones that will pass rigor with the scientific community are the ones that try to locate consciousness in some physical process. It's
Hmm.
probably, the brain, nervous system, locate it in something biological where we can put it on a slide and we can study it under a microscope, please. Because if it's not there, we don't know what to do with this. And um, so I think that that's why the idea of consciousness being non-local is unpalatable, because now you can't account for something that's fundamental to everything about science and
Hmm.
existence in general, but science and the way that you observe and come up with ideas about what it is that you're observing. If your consciousness is observing something physical, but your consciousness doesn't originate in the physical world, you've got a problem to deal with that is probably going to take a century or more of, great philosophers coming together to think about this, because the whole way that we understand the world is through this idea that consciousness is a physical process,
Hmm.
and it's not. And so this is one of the reasons why I think that the scientific community will not touch this in a serious way. Because if the answer is what it appears to be, then it means that we have to remodel everything in our science, from the softest humanities to the hardest core, physics and chemistry. We would have to remodel the whole thing top to bottom. And
Hmm.
it would prove that most of the things that we've understood to this point, what we think we understand scientifically, would have to be rethought. And then, in fact, we were probably getting a lot of it wrong and making huge presumptions to make it fit into that, what you might call the materialist paradigm, to
Hmm.
make the observations of what we know about the world fit into their model has really required them to leave a lot out,
Yeah.
including anything I talk about in my book. I mean,
Right.
the science of the paranormal. Oh, wait, I can just hear it now. Well, let's see your degrees, JM DeBord. Let's
Right.
Where's your PhD from? Do you speak German? Like, yeah, Latin. Sorry, I don't know. I can just see the way that the way they've done this over and over again is by attacking the credentials of the people who present the work. And if they can't do that because the credentials are too good, then they find these really specious ways of attacking the research,
Hmm.
like with Daryl Bem's research into precognition, and the sociologist at University of Illinois, I think, and he'd been in the business for decades, had a long track record, very highly respected, and he puts out a 9-part study on precognition, and 8 of the 9 met the bar for saying that he found it through experimental research under tightly controlled conditions. He found it. It's there. He found precognition, and then I mean, it got published, and oh my God, you should have read what the people, in the academic community, some of them, they were, especially these quote unquote debunkers. Oh my God, why anybody listen to these people, I don't know, but you know, they because they don't, their attacks are specious. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Hmm.
Daryl initially had replication problems. The BEM study, Daryl himself, he didn't have any problems. He retired. He got out before, but then the crap hit the fan because his study got published in a major journal, and the people who didn't want to hear this were apocalyptic about it. And some of the things that they said about him and his research were just crazy. But anyway, if they can't get to the credentials, then they go after the research and they try to create enough of a cloud of suspicion to make people look elsewhere. But then when the cloud is proven to be a whole bunch of nothing, you
Mm-hmm.
know, when the smoke clears, then what's left is the fact that they did replicate them studies at a 20% rate, which is good enough for acceptance to say that he found it. He found it in a lab and he showed us how to do it. And it's been replicated by other people, Julia Mossbridge and Dean Radin. They've done their own study. A lot of other people have done their own studies. And it killed me to find out that this is the case because as I'm as an author, I get a contract from a publisher, in this case, Skyhorse in New York. And they had this series and they needed a writer for hire, basically. And I happen to have enough of a name to be someone that they said, yeah, okay, we'll have this guy write this next book in the series if he wants to, which of course I did because I couldn't believe it. Right, the science of the paranormal, like, oh,
Yeah.
synchronicity. Thank you so much, because I was finally ready to write the material because I'd done years and years of research into this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and I get into the research and find that it really is there, that the debunkers have been debunked, that not all of it is real, but I'll tell you a few things, few of them that are absolutely rock solid. One is spoon bending. Now, I know Randy had his day on that, but
Yeah.
I know people personally who have done it.
I have three
And I
forks.
absolutely believe them. I absolutely believe you, Nicole. I know it happened. I know it's not any of the things that they've written it off as. It is a real, spoon bending. Okay, remote viewing
Mhm.
was the has the best evidence for it, and it's the bedrock of my book. Now, I took readers in the book. I took them on this adventure of going through 150 years of parapsychological research and saying, is there a science here? I present the question that it's been demonstrated to happen, these paranormal things. People have studied it. Is there a real science here to it? And I try to take them all the way through the 150 years in 240 pages. Okay. But I get to the end and I presented remote viewing because, in my opinion, it has the best evidence. It's not necessarily in the raw data, although if you look at the meta-analysis now, there's like over 100 of them.
Mhm.
And, you're talking about some of these, um, getting great scores as far as the statistical power. And but it was the operational side of it that really this was deployed by the military and intelligence communities, like they multiple agencies deployed remote viewing. And even though the programs officially ended in the mid 90s, that's just when they quit talking about it because it worked. It absolutely worked. They didn't know it in 95 because all these different people who were involved with it hadn't come forward yet with their, and then these declassified documents. That was the other side of it. I found a lot of this stuff on the CIA website. I
Yes.
and if anybody needs to know what reality is, it's them. And it's there. It's published in their archives. And I went, yeah, okay. So these are sources. If you look in the book, it has over 100 references in the bibliography. So, yeah, I did my research, as they say, and as I did it, I couldn't believe that some of this stuff was out there and wasn't better known. So I really tried to focus on that and bring it forward so that um, now more people could know it.
Yeah.
Because
And
it does open up the doors to things, because where we started with consciousness,
mhm.
there's a potential, if we really understood this, if we could apply our great scientific minds to this, I think we could make more progress than, I mean, we think we're making progress fast now. We could, but in a different sort of way. It would be progress in human development, human consciousness, human potential, which isn't as interesting as AI. Apparently, they want to create machine potential, and that's where they're going to put all the resources are going into the machine. Oh, we're going to achieve the machine potential. I'm like, Jesus, don't you know the best right here between your own ears?
right.
You know, because
Yeah.
it's proven non-locally to hook into the entire universe. That thing that you think with or that you perceive with, your awareness, the thing that makes you you, is hooked into the whole thing. if some of the theoretical stuff that I talk about in the book is correct.
Right.
You'd have to get into people like David Bohm and his understanding of how the entire universe operated non-locally, which it took me years to get over, to get to that point where I could even accept the idea. Not accept it as in like, but to understand it, how that would
Yeah.
work, you know, because I read like, oh, the implicate order. Okay, that's interesting. And there's the explicate. And he talks about how the physical universe comes out of this substructure, which is just ordered on information. It's like a blueprint. And it's all there and information available on the boundaries of the universe, and everything inside of it is being rendered from that information. And I went, oh, that's interesting. So does that mean that perception, that you could maybe switch your perception to that universal one? Because if the information that makes me me and makes you you is somehow contained on the boundaries of the universe as information, then that means somehow that our awareness is also there too.
Hmm.
And if that boundary of the universe is non-local, as it's all, intertwined, there's a term in physics that's not coming to me right now.
Entangled.
Entangled. Thank you. Oh God, brain fart. Yeah.
It's
Um,
okay.
Yeah, if it really is that way, then it means that a single human mind has access to the entire universal library of information and knowledge. I mean, theoretically, it's true. So
Yeah,
I'm trying to push as far as I can into the limits of that, I'll just say.
I get that. And the if you listen to some of the energy healers and the different people that I interview who are not necessarily into the science side of things, you'll hear them talking about tapping into the Akashic records, which is kind of the uh, global consciousness, all the records of everything that has ever been known, ever will be known. Um, and to think that maybe at some point that could actually be proven to be true, probably with a different name. Scientists are not going to call it the Akashic records, most likely. But so, like, taking a step back and just looking at history, at one point we believed that the sun revolved around the earth. And it took a lot to convince people
Too
that that
much.
was not actually true. So
It
I
took
have
too much.
hope that eventually scientists will be willing to shift the paradigm again. I'm
Without having to crucify more people who are
yes,
the ones
please.
who've come out and said, have talked about this. And people like Brian Josephson, and uh, Rupert Sheldrake. And as part of my research, I followed tweets. I followed these rabbit holes all down, and sometimes I would run across these chains that came from these people who were critical of their research, that were really just childish and mean-spirited. The way they'd be like, calling him Brian Josephson got frozen out of a conference among his colleagues. This is a Nobel Prize winning physicist. The Josephson junction is critical to our understanding of quantum computing, the way that it works. So Brian has been, his ideas, his mind is the bedrock for what we're building now in our society. He won a Nobel Prize for it, and then he decided he was going to go off and study things that were not, study the paranormal. He got invited to a conference, and there were people among his colleagues who said that they would boycott if they didn't rescind the invitation to him.
That is
As
so
a
wrong.
so and childish. I couldn't believe when I read this. I just was like, so you're going to use the power of this social ostracism, to try to stop a man from speaking the truth as he's trying to find out what it is, using the very methods of science that we're asked to follow, and
Mhm.
has proven himself to be one of the best minds of his age. And you're going to pull this kind of crap on him. And they did the same thing to Rupert Sheldrake. They try to shut people up. And with Brian and Rupert, they had such credentials and prestige and demonstrated intelligence already that this stuff just kind of rolls right off of them. Although it does prevent more people from knowing about their research and what they're all about and what
Hmm.
the, um, but they, um, th- the way that they've done this to shut down these voices is, to me, I mean, it struck me as really immature and disrespectful, that it wouldn't do it to anyone else in science, but they'll do it to these people because they dare to talk about things that other people don't believe to be exactly real. Again, air quotes,
Hmm.
like, they're these pioneers and they're at least daring to go there, and they're doing real science and they're doing it in a really interesting way. And it really started to make me wonder whether this is deliberate. Like, it's not just childish or hard-hearted, or, you know, it's something more, because the way that this information has been prevented from getting to the larger, you know,
Hmm.
public is really disingenuous. And it seems it makes me wonder how deliberate it's been. Like, and it's not just because of the materialists who, and they will have there are people who are hardcore atheistic in the scientific community. And if you start talking about something that hints even 1% towards an idea of a god or an afterlife or spirits or something like that, they will go apocalyptic on you if you
Yeah.
are in the academic field. You can get ruined for talking about the things that they don't like. But they there's something more to this, and I wonder if it's because the this rabbit hole eventually leads to something that has, we'll call it, national security implications, global security implications. You know, the a lot of the psi phenomena is also associated with things that we're seeing in the skies, high technology stuff, that there are reverse engineering and black ops programs centered around this stuff. We know that there are.
Hmm.
It's been confirmed now. So, the way that this subject got shut up by the public, it reminds me of the way that classic psyops, they keep people from talking about something because they're trying to, for instance, with UFOs, they're trying to develop this technology in secret
Hmm.
and have, you know, and it's Manhattan Project level of secrecy around it or higher. So they have a huge incentive to keep people off the scent. They've done it with the UFO subject, but I think they also done it with the psi subject because it leads to the same place.
Yeah. Well, if you look at Operation Stargate, like you were saying earlier, they supposedly pulled the plug on that program and that research and said, "Oh, we're not interested." And then they tried to say, "Oh, it was not useful, not fruitful, whatever." But then
Mhm.
we find out later, like very recently, that it probably was still happening just under a different name. And of course, they're denying it, just again, similar to the UAP thing. Um,
Yeah,
but
they're most certainly denying it, and it's also ongoing. That's a fact. It's ongoing and has been. It didn't get shut down in the mid '90s. They just went deeper into secrecy. That's all. That's what they do when they find something that works, and all the record of it disappears. This didn't make it into my book, but I followed the trail of um, what you might call electrogravitic technology. It went all the way up to the late 1920s, and it was centered in Germany. They were on to something. The physicists and engineers in Germany were talking about this stuff, and even getting to the point of, like, I mean, if you read I didn't read the journals, but other people who have, and I trust them as sources, have said that they sound like they've already accepted these things as fact, that they uncovered something, and that it would be the basis for what you might call these flying craft, the flying saucers. How do these things fly around? Well, if you were really interested in the physics of it, you could follow it in these journals until about the late 1920s when what happened in Germany? You know, um,
Yeah.
you know, well, I mean, early 30s before the Nazis completely took over, but by the late 1920s,
Yeah.
this stuff started slipping out like it disappeared. You have to go really deep into archives to even know that any of this stuff was published in the first place, and that the maybe it was the and we that the Nazis, the science program, that they were trying to develop this technology, trying to take what was theoretical and turn it into something that was usable as far as a weapon or to gain an advantage. The same way that we used the atomic bomb, that research that came out in the 20s became the theoretical basis for what Oppenheimer and his crew did to build the atomic bomb.
Hmm.
So these things can come out of they come out of these obscure journals and stuff. Somebody has something that they catch on to about how, oh, you can split an atom and enormous amounts of energy will be released. And everybody's like, nah, that can't be true. That
Like,
could
that's
never
just
happen.
silly.
That's just silly. You'd have to build, can you imagine what you'd have to do to build a bomb that could do something like that? Well, guess what? It actually happened. Um, so anyway, it's the point being is that these things tend to disappear because if you are in charge of national security and you know that's how it's worked in the past, you're watching for this stuff and you're going to try to squash it before it emerges. You can't have this stuff just floating around in the public. So what they've done is they've created this cloud around it, and to scare most people off from
Mhm.
having anything to do with it. you know because in the end, you're developing yourself in a way consciously that becomes a wild card. If you're the people who are trying to engineer society, you can't have these kinds of wild cards walking around. A
Yeah.
new understanding or something happens in one little corner of the world and it starts catching on, and you have the hundredth monkey effect where it starts getting like it starts spreading virally, but like within the collective psyche. Well, now we're talking about a true, like some kind of, change of consciousness like that. It was too much of a wild card. So what you do is you keep people from even finding the door to that. They'll never, you know,
Hmm.
and so I think in a way that there might be a reason for why we're getting scared away from this stuff, at least on a collective level, at any kind of significant sort of way, um, is because there are people who are gaining an advantage by that.
Yeah.
It's a psyop,
Yeah.
and the reason for it is because they want to have control of it.
And
The
go ahead.
Go
Sorry.
ahead. No, no, you. I'd like to hear from you. That
Honestly, I was just going to say, I just recently listened to the audiobook, The Secret of Secrets by Dan Brown.
was it.
It
I've been
was
looking forward to
you
getting into that.
you will totally connect to this book. And yes, it's fiction,
Okay,
but it's
I gotta
there
get
is
it.
a lot of
Oh, I love Dan
you
Brown,
know,
and
he
his writing is,
yeah,
yeah,
he
he
worked
tells a
with
story. Yeah,
IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He brought them in again.
yeah, Dean Radin. I
Dean
wouldn't.
Radin. And
Yeah,
then so
and
I
others.
listened to that, and then I just listened to Dean Radin's latest book. So like you're totally talking my language at this
God,
point tonight. And
what a
that's
time to be
the
alive.
yeah, but the thing is, because we
Uh,
are able to talk about this, assuming that when I publish this on the 28th, that there are no mysterious technical difficulties with the feed.
oh
Um,
God.
so, but because we are able to talk about this, at least in like small little pockets of the world, the people who are reading Dean's book and your book and listening to podcasts like this one, the message is getting out there. It's just there's so many working against it getting out to the public, and there's so many people in the public who don't even want to hear it because that would require a paradigm shift they're not ready for.
Yeah. But they are itching for this. I tell you, you bring these subjects up and you can perk up some ears. You can get people really interested real fast. It's just, it has to be presented in the right way. And yeah, there is a cloud over it that keeps people in general from even getting a whiff of it.
Hmm.
to know that it's there and worth pursuing. And then instead, they go off in some other direction because they think that there's no science to the paranormal. And if there's not a science to it, then you can't believe any of it. And it's just a waste of time trying to find out for yourself whether any of it's true, because if it's unprovable, then it's not scientific. And I found in the end that it opens a much larger question that should be of great interest, especially to those very left-brained, rational people who are the ones who tend to be the gatekeepers in science. You know, we can study this without having to believe that there's a God. In
Hmm.
fact, I think that you can prove that there's an afterlife, or at least very strongly suggest that there is, but the same evidence doesn't necessarily prove that there's a God there, or that there's so the objections that atheists have about a creator God leads them to say, well, there can't be an afterlife because then there must be a God. And I go, actually, no, there can be an
It's,
afterlife without a God. You
yeah.
don't have to believe in any of that. The near death literature shows us that repeatedly, over and over, now millions of times, that people have had the same experience of themselves separately from their body because their body is dead.
Hmm.
Their heart has stopped. In one case, the lady was under surgery and they had drained all the blood out of her body so they had her skull open doing brain surgery on her, and she was under the deepest sort of anesthesia. And she was standing there watching him and reported things. And it's in it's in the literature, what she reported, what the doctor said of what she reported about being aware of what was going on during the surgery, but not from the point of view of her body. There was one lady who'd been blind from birth, so how could she ever have any kind of imagery to be able to say, to describe the surgical instruments that were being used,
Hmm.
you know, to to describe the conversation between the doctors, to talk about things that were going on outside of the room, and
Right.
it was accurate. And it happens over and over again. But anyway, the near death literature, on the one hand, I think it shows definitely, without any doubt, that awareness of oneself, the thing that we call consciousness, exists separately from the body. And the body can be dead and you are still there. That's the first thing we have to accept. The second thing is that there is some kind of afterlife. We go from this world into another world. That world is been there forever, and it has its own way of doing things, and you are part of it. And when you come here to Earth, you're just here for the duration of how long you can make your body last, and then you go back. I Because that happens in all these NDE cases. They talk about the having contact with uh, relatives and loved ones, other spiritual figures. And sometimes when people die together, they see their friends or the people they died with, plane crash, and they're all like going off together into the afterlife. And a lot of them have some kind of experience of what you might call a god or an angel, or something that's like maybe
Hmm.
sort of biblical or religious. Sometimes there's a lot of religious imagery in it, but other times there hasn't necessarily been a lot of religious imagery, but there's definitely an experience of being on the other side, and among others, all the community of souls that are there. But we don't know how far that goes, because the near death people, the longest that any of them has ever been dead and come back that can reliably say is true is about an hour. It might be longer now. This research is constantly changing
Hmm.
because the field of medical science has had to grapple with this. And one of the studies that I quote in the book about near death and Science of the Paranormal about near death experiences came from the journal Resuscitation, and it had like 25 co-authors and 24 or so institutions that were involved in getting to people right after they've had near death, as soon as they can after they've been resuscitated, and ask them what happened, because they could clinically say, yeah, they were dead for 7.5 minutes. Okay, Bob, you're back. You know, so as soon
Yeah.
as they can, being the respectful doctors that they are, they actually set it up so that at each institution they would go and talk to these people to get to them while they're fresh, and then get their story. And the numbers show significantly that these people who experience resuscitation are all having experiences of the afterlife.
Hmm.
So does that make it, and that none of the uh, reasons that have been given for it to be hallucinatory or dream or drug induced or whatever, they went down the list, and they accounted for it when they did their study. And across all these institutions with thousands and thousands of cases, and they could show that none of the reasons that have been given for saying that this is not a spiritual experience, it is something else, it's hallucinatory, it's the last effects of the dying brain, or all that,
Hmm.
every one of them, they knocked it down. Every one of them thoroughly knocked it down and said, no, this cannot be the explanation. This is not why people have these. It's not a DMT rush at the end of life. It's not as a lack of oxygen to the brain. It's not induced by the drugs they give you for CPR. They hit you full of adrenaline and stuff to try to restart your system.
Yeah.
It's not trauma induced. It's none of that. It's not a dream. They went through, they found ways to test for these things, and they knocked them all down. And what they said in the end is they can only guess, but they think that death releases an inhibitory mechanism of the brain to allow consciousness to experience the larger reality that's there all the time. I'm adding that part. But
Yeah.
like Elizabeth Mayer says about this reality that's always in the background, but we're just locked into the thing that we're focused on in the moment, and it keeps us from seeing the larger picture. That's the same thing they said that they think it happens with the mind, is that the brain is actually a valve, or it's an inhibitor. It reduces consciousness down to this little tiny point of awareness. But what consciousness is as itself is part of this larger reality that people are experiencing during near death experiences. And this is medical science that's publishing this with some of their best minds. These are some of the best scientists in the world. I'm not saying specifically with that study, but I went through enough of it and looked up people. Sam Parnia, director at some in New York or something. Anyway, you look him up,
Yeah.
and then all the other people who are the co-authors on the study, and you're like, yeah, these are people who are, their reputations are on the line. And not just that, but they're truly like they want to know what the truth is, and they're using the methods of science to get to that truth. And they publish it in one of the bigger journals out there in medical science, that happen to have that had to grapple with this because they were experiencing it as professionals every day, resuscitation specialists every day. People
Hmm.
were coming back, and some of them were saying that they experienced something that they shouldn't have been able to. And so medical science decided to start to grapple with this. And it took them about 50 years from the time Raymond Moody put out his book to the
Hmm.
time we got to the journal Resuscitation publishing what I think is the most astounding thing I read in all of the published research. For them to say that the brain is the reducing valve of consciousness, and that when the brain dies, you're actually released into some bigger reality in greater capacity that you have within yourself. That your consciousness is actually that greater thing that you experience, but you have to die first. And is that not an indictment of how we have set up our society to keep people from experiencing these things for themselves, to
Hmm.
ridicule it and to shame it and to create clouds of suspicions around it? I mean, we could have, if we would have just done right by the Rhines, JB and
Right.
Louisa,
Yes.
if we would have just done right by them as scientists, PhD botanists out of the University of Chicago, a school known for its academic rigor, who are invited by the president or dean or someone down there at Duke to come down there and set up the parapsychology lab. And they put out all this fantastic research. And the first time it came out if I'm remembering correctly, it was sometime in maybe the late 1930s. The first book came out, and it had about their first 10 years of research in it. And
Hmm.
they showed in the numbers because people were saying, no, we want the data. We want, the science was changing at the time. It was becoming more about the numbers. And they produced it. And the book caught on with the public, and you started seeing, magazine, New Yorker magazine, and whatever. Like it's now getting talked about. And then a few people in the field came out with their criticisms of their research. And it created enough of a cloud around it that people said, oh, ESP, well, maybe it's not real. Oh, well. That was, it got people real excited for a minute because here you have these people associated with Duke University and PhD scientists who've put out something that about what they've learned about reality, and that it's more than what we think. They found through the card guessing, some of the studies that they were getting, when you have a 20% chance under tightly controlled conditions of 1 out of 5 cards out of a deck of guessing what it is just by chance, and you have people who are getting in the high 40s consistently,
Hmm.
tell me that that's not some kind of ESP. you
Right.
know then they did it with dice, psychokinetic effects with dice, and the numbers showed it. But a cloud was created around it because a few prominent people dropped a bomb on it by saying, coming up with a criticism about the way that, well, in this study, the door was open behind them and there was a glass window in the office on the other side, and they might have seen the reflection of the card in that glass window, and so they weren't actually guessing. I mean, never mind the fact that they created an environment of trust in their lab with the people who were doing the work, and they could ask them, oh, did you see this reflected? Like the classic mistake of
Right.
wearing your glasses as you're doing being the interviewer in a card guessing experiment, and they're just seeing the reflection of the card in your glasses, and they're
Right.
not, that's how they're guessing at such a high rate. Like, no, they controlled for all that. But the problem was is this stuff got out there, and it made the public go look elsewhere.
Hmm.
And so the Rhines continued doing all that fabulous research, and they put it out there. And if it would have been taken seriously at the time, as it should have been, then we wouldn't be having these questions now, because accepting this stuff as a fact scientifically would have already happened. If that would have happened in let's say the first round doesn't work, but then the second round of research they put out, now it's the late 1940s, and they're putting out more research, and it's meeting the highest standards. They've, in fact, taken the criticism of their previous research and incorporated it into future, or, the stuff that they're publishing currently. They'd already, as good scientists do, and, made sure that they tightened up their studies to control for things. Now they have some of the most extraordinary, tightly controlled experimental evidence ever presented, and it's not getting the attention that it deserves because of this cloud of suspicion, because a few prominent names raised doubts about something that it turns out later that people who reviewed the criticism
Hmm.
found it to be invalid. The Duke archivist went through, and she's quoted in my book, and I'll say it again, The Science of the Paranormal. Um, they're quoted in the book about saying that she went through point by point and found what the critics said about the Rhine's research, and found that none of it held true over time. Okay, well, failure of replication rate. Early on, maybe they had problems replicating the studies, but once they'd had a chance to actually talk with other people about how to set it up, their other colleagues, scientists, to really get them in, then those replications started coming in that were, that were solid.
Hmm.
And but what happens is that the first few, replications come in and there's problems with it, and they don't, it's failure to replicate. Well, that's all that then scares everybody away. But what if the next 5 studies come in and they all replicate it? Well, because the first 5 didn't replicate it, and that's what people hear about, the next 5 don't get noticed.
Right.
you know That happened with the BEM study in sociology that proved precognition. He, you know, at first they had problems with replication. And then Daryl started talking with people about, you know, well, this is the conditions in my lab and this is what you need to do. Oh, this is why you didn't get to try it again this way, you
Yeah.
know? And then the replications came in and they came in at a 20% success rate, which for something as extraordinary as what the BEM studies showed, you know, 8 out of 9 studies successfully showing a precognition, you know, then I think it's pretty extraordinary that they even got 20% to reproduce it because they have a real problem reproducing the atmosphere that's needed to make this stuff happen.
Hmm.
The PAIR lab at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, they made a very cozy atmosphere. It wasn't like walking into a lab where people in wet lab coats and hard cement floors and sterile fluorescent lights and, you know, getting patted down as you come in. You know,
Yeah.
the they created a cozy atmosphere, and they found that the emotional resonance of people actually has a big effect on making these effects appear in the data
Hmm.
to running as they're running experiments. Like they got some of their best scores from bonded couples and psychokinetic research where you would try to get like make a pendulum swing a little farther, or you know, random number generators to get them to spit out it to going to yes instead of no, or left instead of right, and you
Yeah.
just focus on this. And then they had bonded couple pairs to do this. They got some of the highest rates ever, and they brought in people, thousands and thousands of them, to experiment and see if they could make an effect on the machines or on the random, you know, on the number generators. And the best results came from bonded couples. And Nicole, who else do you think might have been a group that would score very high on the kind of psi tests that they were running there?
Twins. That would be
Twins.
my guess.
The twin studies were fascinating, and you know, I don't know if they had enough. I never saw them break that out as a subgroup in any of their research, but it was children. Children would get into it as a game
Yeah.
and just go crazy with it. But ask me what was the craziest bit of research that I ran across in all the stuff that I reviewed.
What was the craziest bit of research that you ran across?
This is the craziest thing I ran across. Okay. Um, I want to say his name is Payock, Peoch, Payock. I ran across you know, I'm reading it on a page. So um, he is this Frenchman researcher who picked up on what they did at the Pear Lab, and he wanted to build a device to see if he could test for a bonding effect between mind and matter by, okay, this is the craziest idea I've ever heard. He took baby chickens, put a robot in with them during their early development, made them bond with the robot as if it was mother. He put the robot, gave it on, made it move around a room on one half or the other half, based off of random number generator data output from a random number generator. And then he put the baby chicks in the room under the hypothesis that the robot would spend more time near the chicks because they collectively were yearning for mother. And it
And
worked.
oh my
It worked.
goodness.
It worked. The robot spent it was 200% like greater. The numbers weren't even close. It was crazy um how well it worked. And they also did one where the robot was had a candle on it, and the candle was the only source of light in the room. So the baby chicks, wanting to have the light close to them, would psychokinetically interact with the random number generator and make the robot come closer to them. And it worked. I couldn't I couldn't believe when I read that. I was like, that is ingenious. Um, and I just so off the wall, you know.
Okay, and if it can work with baby chicks and their tiny little bird brains, think what we could do as humans.
There you go. You know, I wonder sometimes if we couldn't like, to have like a transformed world, if what it would take is, Mrs. Smith's kindergarten class, but just make those kids believe it so strongly that the world adapts to that vision. A clean, beautiful world of goodness and flowers and, you know, the Divine Mother, and, like make them want it so bad that they could actually make reality happen with their minds in that way, because these group intention seems to be much more powerful than what any one individual can do as far as shaping things on a collective level.
Hmm.
And we're finding, I mean, our science showed us over a century ago that the intention, the awareness of the observer has an effect on the thing that's being observed. We are, in a way, creating our own story collectively through what we believe to be true. And I think that might be part of the reason why we're being limited in what we will accept as being true, or again, air quotes, real.
Hmm.
Because I think someone discovered this centuries ago, and they're the people who want to keep control of everything. And you can't have that kind of wild card out there with people who are realizing what they can do with their consciousness. Um, and maybe and what could happen if you did bring children up from a young age accepting and knowing this all to be real and true.
Hmm.
My book opens with um uh, a guy, oh my god, am I going to forget his name? He it'll come back. He has five higher degrees. Five, he has two PhDs and three master's degrees. He was the subject of parapsychological research for 20 years. He was a instructor at college level in psychology. He wrote a fantastic book about psychic dreams, led dream interpretation groups. Um, God, and I love the guy. I mean, I watched these interviews with him talking about how his parents knew all this stuff to be real and true, and from a young age he was taught to accept it too, because he started to displaying these really extraordinary gifts. There was never anyone telling him he couldn't do these things
Hmm.
or that it couldn't be real. And he then was able to run with it in a way that nobody else had done before. He opens the book with bilocation, because it's in the Star Wars movies where Luke fights Kylo Ren, and it's a projection, but it's more than a projection, because remember, Luke dies at the end of that. That thing that
Yeah.
was there on the planet, as fighting Ren as the Rebel army gets away, because Luke makes his big appearance. He's the last Jedi. Um, the So I wanted to start with that, and it turned out that this guy is actually known for having done it. I got his book on the shelf over here. Dream Symbols and Psychic Power by Alex Tanis.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's why I should have remembered the Tanis
God.
Library at the Rhine Research Center. Duh.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. A friend of mine, a podcaster, Wendy Garrett, has knows the niece who has continued Alex's work at this foundation. Um, and that might have been how I got this book. Thank you to the foundation. So yeah, they're really into that, developing, you know, these. Yeah, it was. They sent this is from the foundation, alextanous.org, TANOUS. Alex demonstrated by location and other things in laboratory settings. They came up with some really ingenious experiments for him to be able to go in and project his consciousness to another location and be able to fully experience physically that location. Like you might say, oh, he was remote viewing. And you go, okay, well, how did he show up at a friend's house, knock
Right.
on the door, come inside, have a conversation for about 15 minutes, drink a glass of tea? And he was actually at the University of Maine at the time, between teaching classes and taking a nap and running a little experiment to see if he could go into deep meditation and project his consciousness to his friend's house and bilocate, not just remote view it, but actually show up there.
Right. The
Because,
drinking the tea is the most
yes.
incredible part.
So because if he was really, hundreds of miles away at the time, and what we have is the friend and the friend's wife, or it was a husband and he knew the wife, is like somehow knew this person very closely. And Alex's work with the Society for Psychical Research, he's going to have people, probably friends, who are people who are part of that mission, who want to advance the science, who want people to know the truth about this. And so, anyway, so you have their depositions basically that this actually happened. So if it did really happen, then, how is Alex Tannis in two places at once?
Hmm.
How does this man with 5 higher degrees, who went for 20 years doing these experiments and explained what he experienced and how he did it in his own mind through basically meditation, concentration, focused intention, but he explained how he did it, breath work, it's there. I got his book right here. I mean, he doesn't talk about it in this one, but in other books, he talks about what he did to become, to develop his abilities. And it all goes back to the idea that he was able to do this because from a young age, he had an atmosphere where he could experiment with these things
Hmm.
freely. And he had an experience of bilocating when he was a child. It was his first experience of it, and it happened spontaneously, and he knows what he experienced. I mean, James Randi might want to enter the chat and be like, well, it must have been a hallucination
Right.
because there is no way you can be in two places at once. And Alex said, no, I jumped off the steps and there was one of me was down at the bottom of the steps and the other me was at the top of the steps. I was 4 years old, 5 years old. I know exactly what happened. It wasn't a hallucination. And then he developed that, because what would have happened is if he would have gone and to most people, even well-intentioned parents, and told them what happened,
Mhm.
they would have told him that it wasn't possible in some form of that or another, and he would have been discouraged away from it from a young age. So now imagine if we take people who've, from a young age, and we make them believe that this stuff is entirely possible, what could happen? Especially if we use the ways for screening for people who have exceptional natural talent at this. It's been shown how to find who these people are. It's not, like there are certain qualities that they have that make them identifiable in the public, and then all you got to do is some simple testing on them, card guessing or something like that. And
Hmm.
you know not saying that that's all you would have to do, but people who have a proclivity for psychic functioning of that kind could be identified. And then imagine if you got them at a young age and you gave them the world-class education and training, you know,
Yeah.
we we could have people doing extraordinary things with their own minds, with their
Yes.
hearts, because they want to. This is one of the things that came out of the research is that if you think of this as a mental game, then you're going to get nowhere with it. It's affected through resonance, like those emotionally bonded couples. It scored higher at the Pear Lab stuff, much higher than normal, like in the control groups and other subgroups.
Hmm.
The same sort of thing happens because with these other experiments, is the people who proved to be best at it were the ones who put their heart into it.
Yeah.
And that when they couldn't put their heart into it, when it did just become this boring, repetitive thing they were doing in a lab because they want hours after hour of you guessing cards or rolling dice or doing whatever, that even the best psychics said that, God, this stuff got boring and I didn't feel like doing it anymore.
Right.
It's like, and so making it fun and having something that you can do from the heart is how you get the psychic functioning to operate, because it appears that it has a mind of its own. Science wants to be able to replicate something, lickety split every time, and we have to have the same numbers. If it can't be replicated, then it's not real.
Hmm.
Um, and you go, well, the thing is that some of these things, like you mentioned energy work earlier, when you tap into the field, it is a larger field of energy that you bioelectrically exist within, and it is universal.
Hmm.
Or we'll just say this: the evidence shows that it's at least planetary. because Michael Persinger's research on that, I think, is pretty conclusive, that showing how the electromagnetic field around the Earth actually interpenetrates everything. And he thinks that's how psychic information could communicate, is through along these sort of magnetic, or the sorts of things like what was measured in the Global Consciousness Project, where random number generators went
Mhm.
wild during events like the attacks on September 11th. Um, but the for they to in order to be able to get these kinds of data, the things that really satisfy science, one of the things I haven't seen from mainstream science is a willingness to adapt to the rules of the game, because you're not playing with matter anymore. And and even if you do use grounded in the principles of physical science, accepted science, even if you set up a study of psi within that framework, you they won't, like, one of the studies came from a guy out of Yale who was looking for psychic functioning in the brain, and he had a big expensive fMRI to use, and he, in a lab, and he put it to use, and he got the expected results. But then when I looked at how he set up the study, I'm like, you just chose random people off the street, and then you
Yeah.
had them do card guessing or whatever. Like, you didn't do any screening either. You didn't screen for any, for people who have a natural ability at this. Because, as I like to say, that you can tell me all you want that, let's say, telepathy is the thing they're trying to study. You can tell me all you want that telepathy isn't real, because you haven't seen it demonstrated under an fMRI in a laboratory condition. But have you seen a person do a one-legged forward front flip?
No.
Look on YouTube anywhere you want to, okay? Now, you can do a one-legged forward front flip. There are people, only a few in the world, who can do it, okay? Now, go back to psi and some of these things that are said to, whether it's telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance. If there are people who can do this, do you think that it's the people who are exceptional at it, who can do it on demand?
Hmm.
Because only a few people who have this can do it on demand in the way that science would want it to be done. Um, why are you not looking for those people to be in your study? If you
Right.
really are a scientist who wants to know these things, then this is one of the first things that if you condense 150 years worth of parapsychological literature down for the modern scientist and say, this is what you've got to do. The first thing is that you can't have people off the street just come in and do this for something that is real specific, like trying to read a picture that's in an envelope, a sealed, completely sealed envelope, person never saw it. And what's the picture, and we're going to watch your brain as you do this, and we're going to look for these markers of, and, like, they won't account for things that that have been shown by this century and a half of research, what you need to do to study this, and yet they still refuse to meet those conditions
Hmm.
in the ones that are coming from the community that are outside of the normal parapsychological ones. And you can tell when you read their research that all they wanted to do was add their name to the debunkers because it makes them part of the cool crowd.
Yeah.
Now they're in the in group because it's cool to make fun of people who have an interest in this stuff, like they did with, Brian Josephson, to, to freeze him out of his own colleagues in physics after he wins a Nobel Prize, and they freeze him out because he decides he's going to use his prestige after winning the Nobel Prize to study the paranormal. And the they froze him out of the community because he dared to study something that was of great interest to him, but that challenged everything that these other scientists think that they know about the world. They have established themselves as these gatekeepers of reality, because science is how we are supposed to know what reality is. So we have the gatekeepers are the people who are the editors at the journals,
Hmm.
the department heads, the prominent people, usually professors within any academic discipline. Um, that are now acting as the gatekeepers when they butt up against something that's like the paranormal. um, but when Dean Johns at Princeton went to publish a paper, he went to an editor. He had a paper ready, and he went to an editor at an engineering journal. Now, Dean Johns, Robert Johns, was the dean of engineering at Princeton, legendary in aeronautics, aeronautical engineering. He, just a giant in the field, was approached by McDonnell, the guy who owned what became McDonnell Douglas, but it was McDonnell Airlines, to ask if he could test to see whether there was such a thing as a mind matter interaction, a psychokinetic effect. Um, so he ended up creating the Pear Lab. He, produced all this fabulous data and was published in the IEEE. He went to another journal to see if they would publish one of his papers, and he said, or maybe it was somebody had to say this for him, maybe because Dean Johns was very Robert Johns was a very humble man, despite his brilliance, so he wouldn't maybe speak up for himself as much as other people did for him later, his integrity, because this journal editor said, yeah, Johns, Dean Robert, I'll publish your paper for you if you can send it to me telepathically. So they're making fun of him and what
Yeah.
he was studying, you know. And
Such a
these are the
This is
gatekeepers.
such a jerk move.
I know, what a jerk move. And that was what I found over and over again among people that in this debunking crowd, because I wanted to spend time in their circles, because there
Mhm.
were legitimate things. There are such things as bad science, and
Right.
we need the hard left-brained rational feed on whatever people. We need them to be part of this if there's ever some serious research into it, because it's going to be multidisciplinary, and you're going to need to have the left brain rationalists there to balance out the right brain people, because it really appears to be in the right brain where this functioning is happening or being facilitated. We have studies now showing a lot of activation in the right hemisphere of the brain during things like perceiving clairvoyantly or telepathically. And I can tell you from experience that it's true. You can switch from the left brain to the right brain, and it starts producing imagery that you can, like, in sensations and stuff. Like it really does speak. It's there, and it's the thing that's in the background all the time, perceiving what's always there, the larger reality. But we're usually so left brain focused that we can't use it as much anymore. In fact, from the moment you walk through the school doors, 5 years old or whatever, your world becomes very limited to what the left brain can, stomach, let's just say, to mix, kind of
Yeah.
the, you get the, okay, I just want to make sure I'm
Yes.
not being too obscure here, because it does come back to the point, the, that these things have been shown to be real, but the discussion of it is being largely shut down because it's not accepted as being real, because it doesn't meet the standards of the gatekeepers who say, well, this is how you prove that something is real according to science. And then you go, but okay, and that seems to be where the stalemate is. And we can always come back to this thing. It's not real, therefore it's not worth studying. The debunkers, that's really what they fall back on. It can't be real, therefore it's not. I mean, that is
Right.
really what their arguments boil down to. But they won't follow the rules of the game that we've been able to observe using scientific methods
Right.
that we've established for, if we really want to take this thing seriously. And I think in the end that it these the gatekeeping on this, the way that they're doing it is, we still need those people to be part of the larger solution that I think is coming, which is when we do this through an interdisciplinary study and we have more people who are like Alex Tannis. They've got a foot in both worlds, the experiencer world and the academic world, because they need to be able to experience it on the one side and go talk to other people about it on the other side. And
Hmm.
we need the left brain people to sort of keep us grounded, but we don't need the debunkers they call them professional skeptics, where they make a career out of it.
Yeah.
And when you're making a career out of something like that, it means that you can have only one opinion about anything that you talk about or
Hmm.
study. They often aren't studying. They just are, they'd like to talk about these things, like James Randi and his spoon bending.
Yeah.
He did real good early on at teaching people how to spot frauds, but he didn't know what to do once those conditions were achieved, where there was no possibility of fraud and people were still bending spoons. And he didn't have an answer except it's not real because it can't be real, because
Right.
their paradigm says it can't be real. This is the materialist paradigm that we've lived under. And I think we're finally at this place where we might be able to crack that open. Collectively, we're finally at a place where we might be able to crack it open and get people to accept that there is this larger reality, and that science isn't necessarily the way that we're going to understand it.
Hmm.
Science, by definition, and if you're talking about the scientific method, by definition, it lacks the tools to study consciousness, because consciousness is not a physical phenomena. And the scientific method is for studying the world of,
Physical phenomena,
yeah,
materials. I
yep,
know. And what upsets me more than anything is going back to the gatekeepers. Science is supposed to be done by curious people.
yeah.
And the minute you say, I'm not interested in that because it doesn't fit my view of the world, you stop being curious.
You stop being a scientist
Yes.
in
And
any
that,
real sort of way, you know? I mean,
yes.
Einstein himself would walk up and say you are a fool for closing your mind off to these things, because in this is, there are answers to larger, let's just say, larger problems the world's facing right now. There are answers in this vein of science
Mhm.
that you'll get there much faster than through the material sciences, the physical sciences. You're going to get there much faster, at least by combining them, like to figure out some kind of form of free energy. We
Mhm.
badly need that to renew the planet. The environment, ecologically, we are in a complete disaster right now.
Mhm.
And what we're seeing is only the tip of the iceberg. We've already put 100 years worth of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's going to take 100 years for that to show up, like in readings and stuff like that. I mean, it is going to be, yeah, I don't want to beat that horse, but like we could probably figure out solutions to that through people who can, like, say, channel the other
Mhm.
side. You know, I talk about that a bit in the science of the paranormal, because there's so many interesting channeler sources out there that have been studied under scientific conditions. And you don't have to accept them all. I know these guys were fooled sometimes. And I say guys because, especially early on, it was all men who did this work,
Yeah.
except for a few.
Mhm.
And then you would have, like, Eustacia Palladino, who was the famous Italian channeler, who was the object of study by many of these men. And she was known to flirt a lot with them and maybe bias their opinion of it a little bit. But yeah, they sat in on her seances, and they certainly saw things that happened that were not explainable, and probably was not a trick. But sometimes there's trickery that goes into this stuff, and there's certainly a motivation to do it, especially when people want to be known for being like a mentalist.
Mhm.
Although if you read the literature and you watch Oz the Mentalist, you can actually figure out what he's most of the time what he's doing. What he did on Rogan was called idiomotor. He held Rogan's wrist and had Rogan get in and guessed what his pin was, and did it live, or, like, recorded it and did it. And he's done it over and over again. These things are in the literature. We know about these things. We know how that idiomotor response works. We know that you can actually feel off of a person if you know how to ask questions the right way. You can guess what their pin is. And
Yeah.
I can start with and go, is the first number between 1 and 5? Is the first number between 6 and 10? Thump, thump. That little ideomotor response comes through. Now I know it's between 6 and 10. And you can do other things to guess,
Yeah.
like, So these things are possible. And I know that there's things like fake spoons. You can order them on Amazon. You can be, oh, I'm a spoon bender. I can bend spoons. And, it's actually it's a stage prop,
Yeah.
but, like you've experienced it. And I know Wendy Garrett and Dean Radin are two other people who experienced it. And then Ed, Ed Kelly at the University of Virginia experienced it. I have it listed in the book. I mean, it's a short list, but these are people who got interested in the paranormal because they experienced it for themselves through spoon bending. Brian Josephson, his name keeps coming up, right? If I
Yeah.
remember correctly, Brian he saw, witnessed spoon bending. Um, with Wendy, she said, and Dean, she said it happened while the spoon was in their own hand.
Hmm.
So it's not that you have to believe that, Oz the mentalist bent this spoon with his mind on live television. It's not that you're David Blaine or David Copperfield or whatever. Like, you're not trying to believe them. What you are believing is that this person that you know very well experienced that, and they know that it's, you can bend spoons, you can get it kind of, a little soft through rubbing it really extremely vigorously. I don't know how you're going to heat up, metal that way. But anyway, these are people who've experienced it, because they did it for themselves. And
Yeah.
what they tell us is that anybody can do it, but there are some people who seem to have a proclivity for it. And if we brought those people in for the studies, like the guy at the Duke study who did 25 card guessing, it was a deck of 25, 20% chance of getting any one particular run. Well, a run was the entire 25. Trial would be yeah, so it would be a trial. So Turdo, look at the card, have them guess what it is, right?
Hmm.
And under controlled conditions on the other side of a screen without wearing glasses and having other obvious giveaways. The
Right.
Ryans were very good about their research and they did a great job of it. Anyway, one guy who became a star there in the Ryan parapsychological research lab there, um, he guessed it 25 times in a row. And they said that you could feel it in the room as it happened, that he was they said sometimes he would get hot, and you could just sense off of the guy when he was going to get hot, like as he was getting into the zone. And he 25 cards in a row.
Yeah. That's amazing. And beyond amazing.
The odds are so staggering that you go, well, I mean, yes, is it possible? Yes, 25 times in a row. But here was the thing. I would hear that from people who would, criticize the research or, something. They'd be like, well, it's not impossible to do it 25 times in a row, even if, you know, all these other conditions were met. You still can't tell me that this is some kind of psychic thing, that it's beyond just guessing, even though there's a 1 in a trillion chance of guessing, you know, one of five cards,
Hmm.
20% chance of something, and you do it 25 times in a row. I can't even begin to work the math out on that, but it's got to be trillions to one odds against chance. Um,
Yes.
the thing is that it wasn't just that one time that he did it. He did it other times, similar demonstrations of this.
Hmm.
Um, there were people like Sean Harriman's, Ingo Swan. You want to talk about a guy who performed under the most extreme. He was in the remote viewing program, but he started off as somebody who was interested because he knew he was an artist, very right brain, um, who he knew that he could do this stuff. And he started in somebody's lab in New York where he lived, where they were doing some kind of experiments. And then he heard about what they were doing at the Stanford Research in Palo Alto, what was the early beginnings of the remote viewing program when Hal Puthoff and uh, Russell Targ, the two directors of the early remote viewing program, he heard about him and basically introduced himself through letter, and then they brought him out and tested him, and he did some really extraordinary things right off the bat. Um, and then he did it again and 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 again for the next 20 years publicly, under operational conditions that included CIA, DIA, NSA, NASA. Other programs came out of Army intelligence, Air Force intelligence. Who knows how many private groups were involved in that?
Mm-hmm.
Or so like someone like Joe McMoneagle, Warrant Officer Joe McMoneagle, who won the Legion of Merit for his psychic spying.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's something that if the boo birds and the debunkers are still out there anywhere listening, which I commend you for getting this far into this discussion because I realize that everything that we've said here is completely antithetical to everything that you believe and think you know to be true. I can, I can respect that because some of the science is not absolutely convincing. There are places where you can criticize. Not some of the science is bad, but here's the thing. For 20 years, this stuff, what we'll call clairvoyance, a form of extrasensory perception, was deployed by military and intelligence. Millions of dollars was spent on this every year. All those three-letter agencies that I just mentioned were involved and more. There were extraordinary people like Ingo Swann and Joe McMoneagle and a whole bunch of others, some of them still around now, who came out of those programs, who were military grade, and they did it over and over again. And it's, again, in my book, I talk about some of the more extraordinary remote viewing cases. And this is from declassified records from the CIA. So I'm relying on the people that need to know what reality is
Mm-hmm.
for them to say that this was a reality that they experienced and that basically they are endorsing it in the sense of, yeah, we're using it. Yeah, we found hostages, we located secret documents, we found spies, we, secret listening posts. We did all this crazy ass psychic spying. We did it for 20 years, and people like Joe McMoneagle, yeah, he won the Legion of Merit for it. Specifically, it says it on his citation for the Legion of Merit. It's for his, they have different wording, but it was for his psychic spying.
Mm-hmm.
Ingo wrote a lot of books about it, gave a lot of interviews. They did it. So if you're still stuck with your gatekeeping ass who wants to sit there and quibble over, the statistical power of this, or, if you want to try to come up with something to say that it's the effect that's been measured is not real, then you're going to have to do a hell of a lot better than you are now. Because I realize that you're winning the game on the collective level. You've gotten people to follow along with you in this little game of, well, you haven't proven anything. This isn't real science. This is pseudoscience. This is blah, blah, blah. And we got armies of people who will descend on you on social media if you try to say otherwise. Um, the reality is that this stuff was already employed and put to use by people who truly have to know what reality,
Mm-hmm.
not your sorry ass sitting there who won't get up and go far enough to actually look into the literature and actually read it. That was the thing from a lot of the debunkers that I read, this professional skeptics, is I would go, wait a minute, that point you're making has been thoroughly shut down.
Right.
That's so why are we back to this again? You won't come off it. And I realize they're not, there's this one on Twitter called Science Girl or something like that, and she makes these pithy little tweets. And she attacked Rupert Sheldrake, and that's how I got notice of her. But I'm like, girl, you're an ornithologist. Please, you know, leave at least Rupert is at biology, which as far as the physical sciences go, is in third place. Then chemistry, then physics.
Mm-hmm.
If physics proves it, okay, chemistry, biology. Ornithology, I'm sorry, you're like number 89 on the list of respect in the physical sciences for you having a PhD in what you do. And you're going to turn around and try to tell Rupert Sheldrake, Sir Rupert Sheldrake.
Right.
I don't know if he's a sir yet, but I mean, Oxford educated, Harvard instruct. I mean, and you're going to try to tell him, in your pithy little tweety sort of way that his research, is not worth a thimbleful of spit, and I'm like, so you actually read the research? No.
No.
No, I know we're both shaking our heads here.
Yeah.
I know you all out there can only hear us. We're watching each other here
Yeah.
also,
There's
uh,
we are
and
shaking our
sometimes sharing
heads.
sharing a little laugh at this because we're
Yes.
we're familiar with the research. And I'm sorry if I'm going off too far along on this. I figured that this is the first opportunity I've had a chance to actually talk about this side of it,
Yeah.
because in all my other interviews I've done, it's been more of a, like, I know I'm not speaking to an audience that's going to understand the finer points of science and no offense, it's just it takes, at least a bachelor's level of education and some classes in the philosophy of science and an interest in science as a community, and
Hmm.
understanding sort of the ethos of it, and what the publishing world really is, you know. Um,
Yes.
it's a so it gave me a chance to talk about some of these things that maybe even didn't necessarily make it into the book, although I did try really hard to make the point at the end and still keep our left brain rationalists, the world works the way we say it is and not any other way, people, to keep them in the game, because we need them still, because I think I proved it through the book, or the chain of logic is there that says that we just that part of us has developed for a reason.
Hmm.
We 200 years ago we found a way of breaking away from superstition, and because the world was ruled by superstition, and we found a way of breaking away from it by saying, prove it, you know prove it, that and here's the method. Okay, it's really simple to follow. I got these steps for you. Just make sure you follow these rules and present it, and then we will all get together, review it, and if we like it, then we agree that you now have your corner on reality. You can
Hmm.
say that this is actually real because it is what, falsifiable, it is replicable, um, and so on. We needed that to happen. But the same people who um, brought that wonderful way of understanding the world that has led to 200 years of, we'll just say, industrial progress, um, a whole different way of knowing the world and giving us the means of controlling it and studying it and utilizing it and all that. That's all that wonderful left brain thinking that's gone into building these wonderful machines. I appreciate my laundry machine. I appreciate it's got a little sensor on it so I don't have to fuck around with it. Okay. So a long story short is, yes, we need you. We need that way of thinking, but it's become stifling. It's become limiting. And there's an arrogance behind it that says that they think that they know how the world really works. And I think that if they really open their eyes to the literature, what is already published, well within reason, we don't have to play at the margins here. We can go right down the center. We can go right down Main Street when it comes to science and say is real. Some of it
Right.
is. Remote viewing absolutely is real. Um, and like telekinesis, spoon bending, absolutely that has happened under controlled conditions. And there are others too. The near death experiences. What it
Hmm.
is, we don't know exactly, but oh, are we just tantalizingly close, you know? But could you ever really see that happening, Nicole? I mean, it does seem like the atheists are the ones who are at the heart of hardcore, academia and science, and they could never stomach that, accepting the findings from near-death studies showing that people really do experience consciousness after death.
So I'm trying to figure out how to put this. I never wish ill on anyone, but at some point, I think those people will die out.
Yes.
I'm an eternal optimist. I could be very wrong.
Uh, well, they say that progress in science happens a funeral at a time, because the old guard eventually dies off and new people can get into those positions, department chair, you know, honored professor of whatever,
Yes, and
where they have the weight.
we can hope that those people are more open-minded to these sorts of things.
Very slowly it happens. One of the things you find is that when people set out a position and then they have to defend it, um, they and build a career around it, they won't accept new evidence that goes against. They become a gatekeeper, only allowing through what it is that affirms what they already believe to be true.
Hmm.
And so they become the biggest hindrance to progress. I saw it happen again and again, and that's why they have to die off for the new guard to come along and maybe push that ball along by saying, actually, yeah, I've read those studies and yeah, the research is solid. Oh yeah, and I grew up with the guy who did the study. I know that he's for real. Like it interconnections between people where it can get you over the hump of skepticism about this stuff.
Right.
Once you can get over that, then you can go, oh, yeah, man, there is some good research here, some really solid stuff, and it's been replicated. And it's fascinating, and it tells us something about the world that we didn't know before. Um, but yeah, I think that part of what is the problem that I traced it back to is that some of the early people involved with this, including people like William James, the famous Harvard department head, he founded basically American psychology at Harvard, and Charles Richet, he was a physical scientist of some kind, maybe a chemist, physiologist. Anyway, he was a Nobel Prize winner who got involved in parapsychological research. The early days of parapsychological research, they were trying to prove life after death and therefore the existence of God. This was the big question at the time. In America, in particular, after the Civil War, people got really interested in seances and
Hmm.
communicating with the dead. People don't understand that spiritualism was bigger than American Idol could ever hope to be as far as a
Right.
cultural phenomenon. And it was huge for a while. And you had people who got involved in the research of it early on who were some of the biggest names in science, and you could openly be interested in this stuff. And they went at it, and they went at it hard. But the problem for some people in the scientific community who were atheists is that what they were trying to do was prove the existence of something that they would never accept,
Hmm.
ever, ever, ever accept that there was a God. So I think it poisoned the well from the beginning. They could have brought that crowd in if they would have found a way of studying the same thing without it being to prove afterlife, spirit, and God. And they were
Yeah.
trying to do it through, I mean, the early telepathy experiments were, it was telepathic communication with the dead. That's what those experiments were. There was, and so what we would call mediumship was telepathy with the dead.
Hmm.
And so by proving telepathy with the dead, they would also prove the existence of the afterlife. And for a lot of people, that would prove God. Although as we talked about, I don't think it proves God at all. I think it just
Yeah.
proves that there's life after death. But that's why early on, why I think science splintered. And that other group that was initially the hardcore rationalist atheists, got bigger and bigger. And I think part of the reason was is because we went through two world wars, and it became really important to focus on reality.
Hmm.
Because when millions of people die, and that's reality, it changes society fundamentally. And I think that's what happened to us back then, that switched us so that science moved away from being able to study any of this stuff effectively. It became this, you know, no, it can't be real. It's not real. Quit talking about it and let's go build more bombs. I mean, that's basically what we did.
Yeah.
We shut down the discussion of this stuff, except there were people in the world of black ops, reverse engineering programs, remote viewing programs. In other words, people who have to deal with reality because their job is to kill and defend the name, whatever you want to call it, CIA, military, all these guys, they got involved with it because they knew that it worked,
Hmm.
and it still went on behind the scenes. And I think that what they've done is they figured out that it's not just like these phenomena are all interrelated, and that um, there is a potential for being able to do things that have national security implications. I mean, if you believe what the people at Skywatcher have reported, Skywatcher is a Air Force special ops group that splintered off contractor, and they work in the dark world of UFO crash retrieval. Um, if you believe what they've been doing, um, I don't know if Skywatcher, they didn't do that. The people who are in Skywatcher that I know of came out of the Air Force and went into private contracting so that they could do this really deep, dark work in, special intelligence operations to retrieve craft that have, you know, and
Hmm.
aliens and all that stuff. I mean, it's real. They've done it anyway. But if you believe what they've done, they have people assets. They call them psionics, psychic assets, and psionics, who are employed to be able to do this stuff. And
Hmm.
one of them is to be able to call down what we call UFOs, to call them down from the sky.
Yeah.
And there are some
It's-
of them who can do it over and over again.
I think that's a lot of people know that as CE5 protocol.
The contact, yeah,
Yeah.
uh, because it's level 5. It's not just seeing an object in the sky, which would be more like a CE1 contact experience, and CE3 might be where you actually see some kind of an inhabitant.
Hmm.
CE5, you're actually in contact with that ship telepathically.
Yeah.
They said that one of the psionic assets was psychically, telepathically controlling the craft when it was hit with an electromagnetic pulse weapon. There was some other group that day that was observing what they were doing and hoping that they would be successful at calling one of these things down so that they could hit it with an electromagnetic pulse weapon and bring it to the ground so they could retrieve it. That's how they're treating that's how they're treating the visitors. And we wonder why they won't just land and announce
Right.
themselves. Because they're first, because we're hitting them with electromagnetic pulse weapons to bring them down, and taking advantage of the fact that you have people who are part of another special ops program who have trained up these psionic assets to be able to do this under conditions where you got all that equipment in the field and you got all those people and you're spending an awful lot of money to have some guy sit there with white noise being beamed into his ears and ping pong balls over his eyes, and he's telepathically communicating, going into meditation for hours, doing brainwave entrainment with the Monroe stuff,
Yeah.
the binaural beats to synchronize the hemispheres of the brain. Then he goes through specific breathing techniques. There's other things that you can do to make your nervous system wake up to this, and then you call out to them, and they respond. And that was where, because it's happened under those sorts of controlled conditions, that's why I say to those professional skeptics who think they know what reality is, do you really know what reality is?
Hmm.
Because I got someone over here I believe more than you who says that their reality that they're spending millions and millions of dollars on understanding better because they can get an advantage over the adversaries using psychic spying and remote influencing and calling spaceships down from the sky. They're oh, they're just a bunch of former Air Force Special Operations specialists. Yeah. Contractors who've made millions. They're independently wealthy now from what they've been able to learn and do. So, okay, so tell me again why they aren't operating in reality. So, anyway, wow,
It's frustrating.
it
It
is.
it really is. As you look at the body of work over the last 50, 60, 70 years, um, the things that have been published, like gone through all of the peer reviews, made it into the journals, and then still nobody hears about it because that's not the flashy thing that is catching everybody's eye this week. And yeah, it's really frustrating. And for people who like going back to the curiosity thing, I went to the Rhine Research Center Sci Games night. That was the first time I saw spoons bend. And I could not get my spoon to bend. But when I saw the person next to me, her spoon just folded in half, like so quickly. It was like it just melted.
Butter. Yep.
It blew my mind. So later, I tried it again. The Rhine Research Group has a Raleigh group, or did. I don't know that they're still meeting. So it was February of 2020. So before the COVID shutdown.
Uh,
I went to a Sunday afternoon meeting because my friend who was running the group said, "Hey, we're going to try spoon bending." And they ran out of spoons, so we were using forks. And I wrote a blog post about it. I'll send it to you. So you don't have to read it, but I'll
I'd
send it to
love,
you.
no, I'd love to
Um,
read it.
but just the experience. And when I finally got that stupid fork to bend, the there was a mind, like a shift in the way that I had to think about the fork to get it to bend. And it wasn't like the Matrix, there is no spoon. It was
Yeah.
really just to feel the energy wrap around myself, feel the energy wrap around the fork. And then the little voice, the intuitive voice in my head said, now. And I just went, took my finger, touched the fork, and it bent over.
Yes. Yes. See, that's what I was trying to say earlier is that there is an independent, intelligent force that's behind this that operates by its own rules. And if we want to really understand this, we have to understand that we are not the masters of this reality. As much as we want to be, we're operating within some kind of a larger system that there are other that and the intelligent energy is the best way I can describe what it really is. It's energy and it's intelligent. It's aware and it has its own rules and it will tell you this is the moment to bend the spoon. You don't I say, "Oh, you hear it in your mind." No, you don't hear it. You translate it as an instruction, but you
Mm-hmm.
just feel like this is the time. And when you describe it later to someone, you might describe it in terms of words, but I don't know if
Right.
this is what it was like for you. But yeah, the it's not it's just in an intuitive sense that this is the
This is
time
it.
to do it. And the belief because you saw somebody else do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to activate it.
Yes.
Dean and Wendy both said the same thing. My two other friends, the spoonbenders, which I'm happy to include you among them now, Nicole. Um, the they've told me that there was something about the group atmosphere. A lot of people who say that they've been able to do it at the spoon bending events say
Mm-hmm.
that when they've tried, they do it successfully there, that they couldn't reproduce it at home just by themselves because
I,
there was something about the group atmosphere that charged them. And seeing other people have that initial success
yep.
and they go, "Oh yeah, that's okay, so now it's possible." And then other people pick up on that belief, which is a point that I made at the very beginning of my book and carried through the whole thing is
Mm-hmm.
that when we believe something is possible, then we tend to follow up and make it real. We went from the moon landing, if you look at when the idea first really entered the mass imagination, it was the first science fiction movie of all time, a man on the moon. And so it was less than 60 years until we made that vision reality, and it was because it first started off that, people believed that we could actually fly, humans to the moon.
Yeah.
Um, so that belief with the spoon bending, I've heard others say the same thing, where it was that moment was when it clicked and they went, okay. And they just keep following the protocol that they're taught by in these classes or whatever. I probably know who did it. Oh God, I've seen him on Thinking Aloud so many times. He was a teacher at Rhine, um, and he did a lot of the spoon bending stuff because he demonstrated. He was a magician.
So
Um,
Lloyd,
yes,
Lloyd
Lloyd
Auerbach,
Auerbach. Yeah.
he's he is not the one who led that. It was a local guy, but I've seen Lloyd at the Rhine do some of the events that he's done. He's an amazing person.
Yes, yes.
Um, I did actually, I came home, I had dinner, and I bent another fork.
Oh,
because
right
I
on.
wanted to prove that I could do it by myself. I'm
Wow.
stubborn.
So you and the fork become one. You
We are
resonate.
friends.
Yeah, okay. But when that fork bent in your hand, what
Mhm.
were you feeling at that moment? Like how were you communicating with the fork in a way? Like, because it's not the
It's
Matrix. It's
no,
not
it's
the
not.
spoon. The spoon isn't there. No, the
No.
spoon is there. That's how I'm going to bend the damn thing. But
Right.
I'm going to do it in a way that, because some of the studies into this have shown that the after the spoons were actually bent psychokinetically, it was if they had been melted because they can
Yeah.
look at the material bonds inside of them and show that they were not bent by force. They had to have been bent by this, and there's actually been some good hypotheses on how that actually works. We might have a mechanical reason for it, but not mechanical in the trickster sort of way, but in a greater capacity of the mind. But I'm curious what you experienced at that moment when you did the.
I was basically taught to make friends with the fork.
Uh-huh.
And so you're cooperating it. You're not trying to force your will on it. And that
Yes.
that really says a lot for everything in the world, you know.
And why the left brain isn't getting it, because it's become good at building bombs. It gets its way by building a bigger bomb. That's what part of the human race has gone off, and a large part of the human race has gone off in this direction of controlling the world through greater force.
Hmm.
But if you read Power versus Force, you would understand that force is crude in comparison to when you can coax a piece of metal into doing something that shouldn't be possible because you make friends with it. I got a retired Air Force general on this side of me over here who,
Yeah.
if I said that, he would just, this guy was in charge of the B-2 program for a while. Like he he would be like, make friends with the fork. What have you been smoking? You
Right?
know? But Brenda Dunn at the Pear Lab said the same thing. She said that the people who performed the best were the ones who had this emotional resonance with the object, and that used this playful, cajoling sort of way,
Mhm.
treating it as if it is sentient and aware of them. Like this isn't just a piece of metal shaped into, something convenient for jabbing at food and sticking it into your mouth. There is an essence to this thing that exists that before, like there's
Yeah.
some, it's almost like it's an archetype. Um, what I saw the other day really blew my mind, and I need to verify this. But there's been studies that showed that you can take a leaf, cut it in half, take half the leaf and put it under this bioluminescent photography thing, and the shape of the entire leaf is still there as this light, um, as like an aura, because you can
Yeah.
see the shape. You put the leaf down and when it's whole, and you can see the entire aura around the outside of it. You cut it in half, take the one half away, and put that other and put it the only a half a leaf now, but it still shows the entire leaf under the aura.
I saw
So
that too. But again, these days I feel like you have to dig deeper, and I
oh
did not
God,
have
I
time to
know.
dig deeper.
That's why it was published research in the science of the paranormal. I had to be able to come up with a criteria for defining what the science is. And I was like, as much as I don't want to be, crabby about accepting things that come from outside of it, like I was saying, I couldn't do Skinwalker Ranch because I didn't find anything in the published literature, even though
Mm,
I know from reading the accounts from people who were there and digging deep into the Bigelow people, that what they experienced real things there and
yeah.
paranormal as hell, but because it wasn't published in a way that I could follow through Google Scholar, basically, um, I couldn't make a case for it in my book, so I couldn't include it as this. I couldn't include it as the science. But we all know that these things are going on there,
Yeah, it's an amazing place.
and amazing place like Sedona, where I had the thing flash at me in the sky,
Yeah.
and some other places in the world. If things are right about what's going on in Egypt right now, I think the whole Egyptology thing is going to have to be rewritten because it appears that there really was a civilization before the earliest dynasties. And those objects that are left behind that we can see, the pyramids and the Sphinx and stuff like that, are nothing compared to what's underground, baby.
Yes.
It's there and it is spectacular. It's, I mean, it's beyond. And it's funny is that there were a lot of Greek and other writers who said that they experienced this stuff for them. They saw the catacomb or um the
The the tunnel, the I
the
know what you're
labyrinth,
talking about.
the labyrinth. Yeah.
That's the word.
And that it goes down hundreds of feet into the ground. And um, in some of those, there's anyway, it's a way of saying there's it's coming out through scientific channels, and there's some really great stuff coming out. We're going to find out that our origins are much different than what we've been led to believe about this whole, hunter gatherer went to agriculture. I mean, that was true for some groups, but over in other parts of the world, they were building underground power plants and flying around and using, technologies that are put our stuff to shame.
Right.
Apparently, they weren't burning any fossil fuels. They were using the power of the mind for healing. You didn't have to ask United Healthcare if you can have surgery for your cancer. They could just, somebody who's trained in the arts could just walk right up and, if you're ready,
Take
brother,
care
for
of.
healing, we know what to do for you. And
Yeah.
then you find out in the end that you're the one who, in the end, is controlling this reality, that you're, as a conscious agent, active in this simulation of sorts. Um, and I'm referring to Donald Hoffman by saying conscious agent. And when I say simulation, I'm referring to, people like Bob Monroe and David
Hmm.
Bohm, who, in their own ways, approached it from different directions, but showed through the holographic theory that
Yep.
our reality is actually nothing. There's no reality to it in the end. If you want to talk about physical expression of, if I can, if it's real, I can feel it. I can see it. I can hear it. I can interact with it in the physical world. And you go, okay, well, what is that thing that I just, that table I just knocked on? Let's look at the atoms. Oh, I'm
Right.
sorry. Is that 99.9% empty space?
Yes.
Oh, that thing you called an electron that is supposed to be the foundation of atomic physics, which, by the way, is only 0.01% of the known universe. But okay, atomic matter that follows our periodic table, and this is how we understand the physical world. Okay, well, let's look at what that really is. All right. Well, what is an electron? Okay, well, according to our quantum math, the electron isn't an actual physical object. It's a cloud of possibility that exists around the core of the atom. I mean, this is accepted physics, okay? And you go, okay, so that means that the electron, this fundamental particle, isn't actually there. I mean, most of the time it's not there because the probability for where it is in space hasn't been determined because of what? There's no observer.
Right.
So it all exists as just a possibility until somebody defines what it is. Where is that electron in space? And then, that's how we build the periodic table. And it's built atop the very fundamental way that we understand our material sciences, the world of atomic mass, is built on the idea that 99% of it isn't actually there. you know, and you go, and everything else is, and the best explanation that I found, if you want to go hardcore physics, was the holographic principle. The
Hmm.
I think it's been proven that the matter, the world of matter, is it works under holographic principles. I won't say that it's a hologram because people get the wrong idea. It
Right.
works under holographic principles that the whole is in lower resolution, available to be seen in any one of its single parts. So that's why an individual human consciousness can be also at simultaneously the collective human consciousness or the collective consciousness of the universe itself, while it's also one point, because in its most fundamental way that we are shaped from atoms on up, it all follows those rules. I think the explanations are there. It's just that we've closed ourselves off to it. There's a guy named Ed May who was 10 years, he ran, you had on the one hand, you had the SRI remote viewing program.
Hmm.
Ed May was on the military side or intelligence side. Anyway, he ran another remote viewing program. So you had, Russ Targ and Hal Puthoff doing their thing. Then May came along and started running it for somebody else. And he spent the first 10 years as like the director of science, and then the next 10 years as the director of the overall program, if I remember his biography appropriately. The important thing is the man is a brilliant physicist. And he has come up with theories about how remote viewing works based on entropy. He's grounding it in the physical sciences. And basically, what he noticed is there's something called the Shannon. Oh God, I'm going to sound like a. I think they just call it Shannon entropy or a Shannon distribution or something. Basically, it is a measure of the curve of the distribution of energy and how it's responding to us like a stimuli. And they've what they've shown is that the greater the Shannon entropy, it has something to do with the information that's present. But anyway, Ed spelled it all out. It's in the paper. When I wrote the book, felt like I understood it well enough to write a paragraph or two about it. But
Yeah.
I think that Ed may have really come on something with that theory, because he's shown that this is the one of the examples when you do the guessing in envelopes of like somebody takes a random picture, puts it in an envelope, and you got to guess what it is
Hmm.
as the experimentee, or they're so anyway, what they showed was is that the pictures that had more energy in them, in other words, a higher grade of Shannon entropy, are the ones that people score better when those are the object or the thing to be viewed. So if you have like a sleeping dog, there's no energy there. There's no change in entropy. And it's not just thinking of it as a static image, because I could take a photo of a leaping dog and it's a moment caught in time, but
Hmm.
that the energy of that leap is somehow present in that photo, even though it's only one frame of a continuous picture. But anyway, you take that and you mix that in when people are doing these clairvoyance tests, and you see the numbers rocket on the number of successful hits. And Ed thinks it's because of the change in the entropy, basically. And it's in a specific way of measuring. It's Shannon entropy, which has something to do with change of like the gradient of information. And it's in there. So it's a way of saying, if you've come this far 2 hours into our conversation, I have finally given you the thing that if you are a serious scientist, go look up Ed May. And then Russell Targ and Elizabeth Rauscher, they
Hmm.
wrote a paper on eight dimensional hyperspace physics or math. They Elizabeth worked for Lawrence Livermore, and Russell, of course, was one of the researchers in the remote viewing program. He's a laser physicist. They approached it as serious physicists, and they tried to come up with a model that incorporates psi and ESP and everything into it and accounts for it. And their paper on eight-dimensional hyperspace math, I think, is along with Ed. If you people out there who are craving the physical science side of this, I would highly recommend those paths um, as fruitful endeavors to look into. At least review the literature if
Hmm.
there's any scientists out there who are really interested in this stuff, because I think those, after I did months of this, I can leave you those two morsels for
Yeah.
you to follow. And there's probably a couple others in the science of the paranormal that a serious scientist would respect enough to say, if they want to go down this path, I've done, I can point you in the right direction.
Yeah.
So,
And so it has been 2 hours. Thank you for talking to me for so long. To wrap this up in a
yeah.
nice little bow, because you were talking about things that you could read the science of the paranormal and look at the end notes at the end of the book, because you have listed all of these different all of these different sources that you got your information from. So the people who are listening who are like, ooh, that study sounds interesting. There's a possibility it's in the back of the book, right?
Yes, yes, that Payok, the guy who did the one with the chickens, that's that's in there. Yeah, over what, 120 citations or something. I mean, I'm not writing a master's thesis or anything, but I was trying to make people who are interested in this, truly interested in the science side of it. I tried to give them enough meat to chew on and to show them that I'm a fair, even though I'm an experiencer too, I'm also a fair judge when it comes to, is this science presentable at this level? Because I am trying to make an argument that could fundamentally change the paradigm. Because if I can get people to accept the science of the paranormal, then what the science shows very clearly is that there are things that we call paranormal that are real. And if we can accept those things, now we're on to something. And I think we could very quickly change the dynamics of what we're experiencing among a species that is self-destructing on its and destroying its own home.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk about that another time.
Yeah.
But yeah, we are in a crisis, and one of the things they've shown us is that these paranormal abilities tend to activate spontaneously during times of crisis. Some of the most powerful events happen when people at the point of death of loved ones, and it was psychic communication and apparition appearance. I
Mhm.
didn't get a chance to talk a lot about that because there isn't a lot of science for it, because these are very hard things to trace. But the highest reports of like um, visitation dreams that
Yeah.
were extremely powerful, or of like full body apparitions and things like that. It has become usually driven by some kind of need, because of a crisis that's been created. And so we might be creating a collective crisis so that we can activate this power of the mind just in time to save our asses with it. That's a
I hope
mouthful,
so.
really. Thank you for giving me the
Yes.
opportunity. I went on and on, but I didn't let you, you weren't stopping me. So I just talked because I figured that there was something interesting coming out of my mouth, and I
There
appreciate
was.
you
There was a lot
indulging
interesting.
indulging me on
No,
that.
no, I enjoyed it. I prefer to listen than to talk anyway, and you had a lot of information to share, so I totally appreciate it.
I gave you
Um,
about half the book there.
I
You don't have to
it's
read,
a really
you
good
only read
teaser.
half the book. You got the first half. Yeah.
Um,
Uh,
okay, tell everybody where they can get the book.
it was when it was released in September in all the bookstores. I mean, it's still at the major retailers where you would expect it. But I found it in off the wall bookstore places, which I was really happy to hear. It's actually on bookshelves. If you don't understand
Awesome.
publishing world, only about 10% of books actually make it onto a bookshelf. So to make it that far means you have to have a publisher behind you with enough clout to, get the retailers to even stock it. But if it doesn't sell within the first 3 months, which we're at about the end of that now, then they send it back to the publisher and get their money back. So,
Hey,
which
go
means it
buy the
comes
book.
it comes out of my pocket too,
Right.
in a way, as a royalty, on the royalties end. But yeah, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and bookshop.org is one of my favorite places. And
Mhm.
JM DeBord, DeBord, is my website. I also teach dream interpretation, and it's we didn't have a chance to talk about some of the crazy paranormal dreams and studies of dreams that have been done, but there's almost an entire chapter on that subject in the book. And some people have said that they enjoyed that the most about the book, the dream part, because it's obviously where my, you know, I mean, I got into studying precognition 15, maybe not quite 15 years ago because of precognitive dreams. And
Yeah.
it was because I was asked as a dream interpreter about them, and I went, uh, well, let me get back to you on that. And that was while I was on Coast to Coast AM, back when it was a huge audience listening, and you know, um, for overnight shows, at least for radio. And
Yeah.
George Norrie pulled that out on me, and I went, So I made sure the next time I was on Coast to Coast that I came back armed with the information, because it was in the wheelhouse for me with dreams, and that's what opened up the door. So really, the answer to your first question, what got me into the paranormal, I would have to revise that question, because it's in my book about nightmares. I had a paranormal experience through my dreams that was probably my first taste of that. Uh, it would have been just before the incident with the telescope. I
Interesting.
had I had a first nightmare of a 30 years of recurring nightmares was something that in the end I had to treat as paranormal in order to resolve it. Whether it was real or not, I don't know, because supposedly undead people from, the past can't haunt you in your dreams. But I had 30 years of it and finally resolved it through using a shamanic technique. So, uh,
Is
yeah, that's my book on nightmares, folks.
I was about to say, is that one of your other books? Because I saw you've
Yeah,
written other books. Okay.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
I'll
Nightmares.
link
Yeah.
I'll link
Please
to
do.
the books
JM DeBord.
page.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll link to the books page and I'll link to the Amazon page. And I'd love to have you back on to actually talk about dreams at some
We could
point.
do, yeah, and the paranormal dream, ESP, and predictive dreams, and
Mhm.
visitation ones. And I have ways of, and I would love for someone to take an interest in this. I went and figured out how you can apply a checklist of how to determine if it's a real visitation dream
Oh, wow.
and how to tell if it's a precognitive dream. Because I went into it and I found that there were certain things with the ones that I most have the highest confidence that they were what they appear to be, because dreams can be all sorts of things, right? But I have for precognitive and visitation dreams. It's on my blog at dreams123.net in case anyone, you know, you search terms I've already given you here that you could find it. But yeah, so it's actually like a checklist to go down to understand whether it's a serious, like, it's some kind of
Truly.
ESP,
Yeah.
or if it's, yeah. So it's a way of saying, God, we could have a whole nother
Yes.
long conversation about this. So maybe we will save it for the next time. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I
That
would
would be
definitely love to have you back for that.
that would be cool. And I'm glad to have met you and made this connection. It seems that we have a mutual interest in things that are, deep to near and dear to our hearts. And I'm sure there's a lot more that you would talk about. You started talking about energy work, and that's something that's getting my attention lately. So, um, yeah, and then the spoon bending, and you've been to Rhine. Oh my God, I'm so jealous. It's on my list. Monroe, I got to get to that area of the country. I got to
Yeah.
get back there because I got Monroe Institute, the ARE in Virginia Beach, and Rhine. I've got it. Those are like, I got to get to that.
Yeah. And
Yeah, those are my people.
I still haven't been to Monroe or ARE. As many people as I've talked to who've done work and studied and everything at both, I still haven't been there yet. So they're both on my list too.
I'll see you there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, JM, for taking the time to talk to me, and I can't wait to talk to you again. Thanks again to JM for such a great conversation, and thank you for listening. If you want to share your own personal paranormal experiences of any type, use the contact form at peeppodcast.com to get in touch. You can be as anonymous as you like, or you can let your paranormal freak flag fly and share your name. Either way, I'm happy to hear from you. Sharing our stories helps people realize that the paranormal is much more normal than they think. That's PEEP podcast.com. Remember, that stands for People Experiencing Everyday Paranormal. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter to keep up with the podcast and all my creative and energetic endeavors. I usually only email it once a month unless I have a special event that you should know about. You'll receive briefs on recent episodes, information on any upcoming appearances, plus some occasional fun extras. If you enjoy the podcast, please give it some rating love on your favorite podcast app. Share it with friends and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Ratings, reviews, and shares help platforms like Apple Podcast and Spotify know it's worthy of surfacing to new listeners. And as we build our audience, we have more chances to hear their paranormal stories. A huge thank you to everyone who has given the show some love. You're helping it grow. No matter how you support the show, listening, telling others about it, or any other way, I absolutely appreciate your being here. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe and be well.